Hey, welcome back, everybody. My guest today is Steve Morris. And God, Steve, we go back maybe a whole week or so.
Whole week, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
We were introduced by a friend, Jeff Kozatek. Excuse me, Jeff.
Mm.
And Jeff thought that you'd make an excellent guest. We had a wonderful conversation last week, and I want to get right to the meat of our discussion. And excuse me, real quick. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be on my podcast today. I'm so excited about this topic. I just bypassed my initial thank you to you.
No worries, Peter. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I mean, I really enjoy having these discussions and just getting more information out there into the world to help people have a better life and better business.
Perfect. And the topic at hand is something that I was introduced to maybe 6, 8 months ago when a colleague sent me this thing about psychological safety. And I went, oh, what is that? As Scooby would say. And the more I started reading about this, the more I equated it to the world of improv leadership. And
Mm.
then in our discussion, you've been talking about this working with your clients. My audience may not even understand what this is. So if you could kind of go in that direction and describe what psychological safety is and how you discovered it, and we'll take that conversation from there.
Yeah, well, sure. So, I have to caveat that I'm not an expert in this either, right? It's something that I've become aware of and done some research on it and bringing into, I bring into the work that I do with my clients. And so where this came from was, I'm working with leadership teams. I'm helping teams figure out how to get better, more cohesive, more aligned to be able to have those conversations. And in the research that I was doing, I'd come across Google Project Aristotle. And so Google did this research on their high performing teams. Who are the best teams that they had at Google? And how come those teams, what were the characteristics of those particular teams that made them high performing? And they found this one trait, this one thing that really differentiated their top teams from the other teams. And that was this concept of psychological safety. Teams that were knocking the ball out of the ballpark had it, and the other teams didn't. And so, what is psychological safety? Right. So it's creating this atmosphere, this environment in the team where somebody feels safe to be able to put up their hand and say, hey, I don't know what's going on right now. Sorry, I didn't understand, what we decided in the last meeting. Hey, I'm getting overwhelmed. I need some help. And they can do that without fear of being shamed or ridiculed or ostracized, voted off the island, all of that stuff, right? To be able, and so the team leads, create this environment where people feel like they're able to put up their hand and ask for help. And I think it's just such a key concept because I've worked in a lot of high performing teams that we've gone and done incredible things like designing multi-million-dollar racing yachts. Some of those teams I can see where we had that environment. I didn't know what it was called then, but we had it.
Mhm.
And I also saw teams where we didn't have that and, where we weren't able to achieve the results we wanted. So when I found out about this research, I'd finally, I'd got some words, put a name to, the things that I had been experienced. And then I could bring that to my clients as well.
And it's such a, I don't know, unique concept, but then I don't understand why it's so unique because my in my mindset, this is how we all should be leading and provided a culture that you're not ridiculed for speaking your mind, unless it's something completely outrageous and offensive, whatever. But as it relates to your work, it relates to ideas. Um, but it seems like that that is almost. I think people are afraid to do that because the culture that has already been created within an organization. So, in thinking about that with your clients, how do you get them to start thinking differently and start changing that culture to one of more that has, has a great deal of respect for
Right.
your fellow person?
Well, I think, it starts really with introducing the concept and pointing it out. Because I really feel like, if I look at my experience and the work that I do with my clients, that, sometimes people just, behave in certain types of ways, right, that have come from the past, the old way that, business kind of used to be run.
Hmm.
And I think you and I kind of joked about this in our first conversation, but that that T-shirt that you can go and buy in shops, that says "Beatings will continue until morale improves." Well, that, you know, it's nice to have that as a joke, but it's no fun if you actually are experiencing that, right? Or some form of that. And I sort of feel like that was more of the type of environment 30 years ago in trying to run a business. It doesn't fly anymore these days, of course. It didn't fly then either. But so in sort of trying to introduce this subject, it's really about like just starting to notice like what people say. And I've been tremendously interested in this from, just these aspects of like creative work together, this concept of brainstorming, right? And these ideas of, the sort of traditional brainstorming session where everybody's sitting around the table and there's one person at the front of the room and they've got control of the marker,
Hmm.
right? And then somebody says, well, how about this idea? And why, that's a silly idea. Who would do that, right? And just, shutting people down. But I don't think people kind of really realize that that's what's going on in the conversation, right? It's just sort of like baked into the environment. But when you start calling it out and you start noticing it and you start saying that look out for these types of behaviors, then people are like, oh, gee, I can't believe I just sort of said that, right? And start changing their mindset around it. So it's a progression. It can't happen overnight, but it's a journey to go on for sure.
Yeah, in the improv world, when you talk about brainstorm, we say you can't create and criticize in the same space. And I have a client that wanted me to do this brainstorming sessions, divergent thinking with his team. And hindsight being 2020, I needed to put more things in front of it before we got to that point in time. And the CEO was all in, but so basically we were trying to banter ideas real quickly. Some would turn them into dissertations, and then we've tried that before, and I just saw the wheels come
Oh, yes.
completely off
Mm.
this car, and I went, okay, and I talked to the CEO after the fact. I said, I've learned a lot about, and I think you have too, about it's going to take a while, and we need more front, up front, earlier kind of adoption into it until we get them in the room.
Yeah. Well, no, but I think that's, just having the experience and seeing like, oh, suddenly just, this sentence came out into the room. Oh, we can't do that. We've never done it before like that. We always do it the old way, whatever. Um, and then, just to see, people's feelings and reactions from that. They're like, okay, got it. All right. Well, I'm just gonna like bottle it up.
Hmm.
I'm not going to say anything more. Fold the arms, lean back,
Yeah.
and they're done. But so if you can just say, oh, did you see what happened right then? Did you notice that? So we need to do things a little differently. And how about instead of saying that, we do the improv thing, which is yes and, right?
Thank you. Yeah, and you're right on spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's changing. I mean, I did a creativity workshop for a CPA firm, but the managing partner was in the firm, was in the room with everybody, and I asked them for crazy ideas. They barely even gave me the ideas, so I had to talk to the managing partner. I kind of called a quick break, got everybody out of the room, and said, "You know what's happening? They're not saying anything because you're sitting here. They're afraid to. So we got one or two things we can do. Either you give me the craziest idea when everybody comes back, or and I kind of hesitate, or I would like to say that you would get something else to do and you'd leave the meeting, so they can because this is why you hired me and you're stifling them."
Hmm.
And I got a real hurt look at first, but then they understood, and I said, "So which one is it?" He goes, "I'll leave." And it was getting up. I said, "No, no, no. I'm what say. I'll take care of it. So everybody came back, set the tone. I said he wanted to see it. He's got things to do. Want to have a conversation. And as soon as he left the room, all of a sudden it became filled with oxygen.
Right. Yeah.
But we see that all the time, and we ask people for their thoughts and ideas, but if they don't align to what we're thinking, you deem the crazy one.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the techniques that I use with teams that I'm working with is part of the Lego serious play methodology. Um, so this has been something, of course, I haven't done a lot in the last year because of COVID and things, but there's a whole methodology around getting a group of people to have, creative experience together. And there's a lot in the setup for this, right? And it's these things like, and I often get clients saying, well, can I just sit in the back of the room and watch? And it's like, no, you're either at the table participating and being part of this, or you're not in the room. You're either a participant or you're leading you're me and you're leading the facilitation. So that's the first thing, because you have to create this psychologically safe environment for people to talk. And then the second thing we do is, as part of the whole methodology, is we level the playing field. So for the people around the table, it doesn't matter what their title is. I take them through a very set sequence that levels the playing field and allows everybody to see that their voice is equally valid, able to, talk about their ideas, and everyone's going to listen. So we make sure that no one grabs more airtime than somebody else. And the really cool thing about the particular methodology is, so people are taking their ideas and they're building models of them. And then these models are metaphors for their ideas. And you can't be wrong about that. If you say, whatever this model represents to me, well, no one can say, you're wrong, because that is the truth. This is what this model represents to me. And then it really creates this environment where people feel safe to now start talking about, really what's going on inside. So I love working with teams and taking them on that sort of a journey.
You can imagine that you have some, when you're going through this process of leveling the playing field, that you've got maybe some closed-minded people, or some, no, well, let me word it, ego gets in the way. How do you manage that with someone with that ego issue?
I haven't had to deal with ego as much as just sort of like the resistance of sort of coming into the room and wanting to participate. And so I do remember this one workshop I did where one individual sort of came into the room, clearly was sort of not in a great mood, kind of sort of sat down, crossed the arms, sort of was looking a little bit puzzled at this activity that we're about to do. We just proceeded ahead, right? And there's sort of like, I have faith in the process. We go through the process, and the individual just, started engaging in it, and ended up building a model that was fairly unusual. I'll just put it that way. But what came out of it when it came time for them to tell the story about their model was this incredible story came out from inside them about, the fact that they were nearing retirement, and they really cared, they'd been in this position for many years. They cared about their organization. They were worried about being able to transfer their knowledge and to have it continue in the organization. They wanted to teach people everything that they knew. This whole story came out, and everybody was kind of like, oh my gosh, where did this come from? Because all of this suddenly got turned into, instead of this resistance, it was actually, I want to give. But they had to sort of work through that, feeling like maybe they weren't feeling it was safe to be able to say that they wanted to give, but this taking them through the methodology allowed them, and creating the environment, right? Creating the environment for psychological safety allowed them to talk about their story, and everybody was blown away. I just love that.
So when you ask them that they're going to take, we're going to brainstorm, they're going to, what type of prompt do you give them so they can build their model?
Well, open-ended questions. That's always the thing. So it might be, what does a good day look like in your office?
Right.
Right. And so that's something that doesn't have a right or wrong answer to it. You can't just say yes or no to that.
Right.
So people can now start describing, what does a good day look like? When we go on a particular journey too, that starts with the individual, always start with the individual,
Mhm.
and then you work to the team, and then you work to the environment. So you're sort of building from the center out, working with a group. And so the progression of questions will be going along those things like, um, tell us something about your identity. Tell us about your team. How do you see your team's identity? Where do you see your team fitting into the organization? So we're sort of always moving along a progression like that. But it's definitely, open-ended questions and nothing that can be answered by yes or no.
Okay, 'cause I wanted to get a feel or an idea of those questions. At first I thought it was a question around how can you make your job a little bit better or that, but I like the aspect of what does a good day look like, and then taking it from almost like Simon Sinek, you start with the why, then you come all the way back out. Um,
Yeah. And we can even go negative sometimes too. In a way, it'd be like, so describe a nightmare boss. All right, let's put it all out there.
and does the team just automatically go look at the boss and just go, I'd rather not answer that one right now.
Because I'm creating a psychologically safe environment so
Right.
people can build it into the model and say, that's what I think a nightmare boss, exhibits. And no pointing fingers around the table, just looking at the model.
So I mean, as much as I'm so fascinated by it, I'm sitting here thinking about the application, the buy-in, and in an environment that probably grew up around something just the opposite, and that that pushback. So I guess the one of the questions, because you work with these teams and within these organizations, and you were part of a huge team building these multi-million dollar, billion dollar racing yachts.
Mm-hmm.
And we had talked about that psychological safety was not used, that terminology, but we both experienced maybe an environment similar to that, and also one that's just complete opposite. How do you sell this to the CEO when you're pitching them the idea that this is something that will help their business?
Well, number one is point to Google, right?
Well, that's well said.
Yeah.
I
Point to the research. Like, where did it come from? And Google isn't the only people who've been doing this research, right? There's Professor Amy Edmondson, I think if I've got her name right, has been doing research on this, and she's done a TED talk about it. But point to the research as the first thing, and it's sort of always like, why are we having the conversation with the CEO in the first place? The CEO has a goal, has vision for where they're trying to take the business, and perhaps they might be feeling a little stuck. Maybe they might be feeling challenged. Maybe they're trying to figure out, like, how can we get our team to come along and to be a part of the vision. And there's a lot of different components about, depending on how that conversation goes, as to what tool I might pull out of my toolbox and say, this is something that I think that we can use to address where you're trying to get to with your team.
I'm reading this book right now. Somebody turned me on to it, and the title of the book is "A CEO Only Does Three Things,"
Okay.
and the three things are in this order: culture, the people, and the numbers. And number one is the culture. And when I read this, and actually it's one of the quotes that's in the book from Peter Drucker: culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yep.
Without the right culture in place, it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
And
Well, mhm.
no, please.
I certainly, saw that with, some of the very high performing teams that I was working with and have worked with and are working with now is just when you create that right environment, then people are able to excel, right? People are able to come and reach their full potential in the team. And it's not all serious either. Like we can have a little bit of fun with it, like, to be able to smile and things and joke around and, just to really be able to get to that point where now everybody's like really able to wholeheartedly bring their best to the team. And but these things go hand in hand as well, and this is what we work on with the entrepreneurial operating system with EOS, that is a simple system of tools that I'm bringing to business owners and business leadership teams to help them get what they want from their business. But we work on these very specific things of getting the right people into the organization, doing the right things, and creating the environment around the core values of the organization and the focus of the organization, so all of that can go together. I work with my clients to help them be able to articulate and talk about their vision for the organization, but you can't bring a great vision to reality if you don't have great people in the organization. And I think the key thing that we work on with our clients is that great people are unique to each organization. They're unique to the culture, right? So the culture is, establishing the environment in the organization, and then we get the right people who come and fit that culture like a glove. Mm-hmm. But we do talk about, using the core values of the organization to be able to identify, who are some people who, they might be rock stars, they might be meeting their numbers, they might be knocking the ball out of the ballpark, but they just don't fit the culture of the organization. And I'm sure you've probably worked with people like this. I've encountered them in my career as well. I mean, the cynical outlook, at 9 o'clock in the morning, or they're the, people who are looking at organizational change and figuring out, well, I'll just stay under the radar and, this will change and I'm not going to buy into this. And people who are sort of snipping away around the edges, that sort of mindset doesn't help an organization, reach where it needs to. And you've got to be able to figure out who those people are who aren't on board with what your culture is, and find something else for them to do.
As you're telling that story, I reflected back to a colleague shared a story that, and she was an HR person, on how they flipped the hiring process. So they senior management team would get together and they got clear vision on what the mission statement, the vision statement, the core values and core competencies of the organization is. They put it up on their website, and when somebody would apply for a job, the first thing they had to do was go to the website, understand it, and see if they fit in that culture. And then there was a phone interview. So, Steve, tell me how, after spending time on the website, how do you see yourself fitting into our culture?
Right.
If they couldn't articulate it, or then there was no second interview.
Yeah.
And then those who could and had that vision, then they bring them in for another interview and still talk about the culture, the vision stuff, to make sure that they weren't just telling them what they thought we wanted to hear. And by the time they hired that person, it may take a little bit of time, but the what's the word I'm looking for? There was very little turnover from those individuals who went through that process. Where before, here, fill out this application, you hired, which and those people would leave the organization sooner than anything else. So it's like
Right.
we have to think about it. If we're going to put this psychological safety in place, we've got to flip the switch on a lot of on how we hire those people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's a very specific thing that we work on in the entrepreneurial operating system, is defining what your core values are and then using them in the hiring and the review process to make sure that you're attracting the people you want in your business and repelling the people that you don't want, right? It becomes a litmus test. So it's a very important thing. And I love this because I like, there's one team that I worked with that really sort of stands out in my mind, that, how they built their team very deliberately, very intentionally, each new person coming onto the team, making sure that they fit the culture of the organization. And when I went and worked with that team, it was just like there was a different atmosphere, right? It was just like everybody's organized, they know what they're doing, their roles are sorted out, they have clarity around what they were doing. And then particularly this was a sailing team, so they weren't arguing about who's going to pull this rope and just sort of internal things on the boat. Having that coordination, that clarity, that cohesion in the team freed up their energy, that allowed them to now look up and out of the boat. And now everybody had the energy to be much more strategic, to be looking out at, what's the competition doing? What's the environment doing? Where are we? What's happening next? And having that sort of strategic discussion. And it just, the team was just operating at a higher level because of really creating the right culture, the right cohesion there.
And when you're performing at that high level, it's 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 almost like I've witnessed this, that communication, verbal communication, is not always necessary. The one's body language. I mean, I've been married, my wife, 25 years. I've known her 27 years. We can have a conversation across the room and not say a word. And it's but that takes time.
Mm-hmm.
But those high performing teams, and in the improv world, we call that the group mind. Well, I know what everybody else is doing and what they're supposed to be doing, and I don't have to instruct them. They equate that back to the Chicago Bears when they won the Super Bowl. That cohesiveness of that team, where everybody knew and they could just communicate with body language. Do you see the same thing? These high performing teams that you're working with, that when they get to that point, 'cause it sounded like on that racing yacht that they were experiencing that.
Yeah, and it's um, unfortunately rarer than you would hope, but it's because it's sometimes hard. I mean, things like this do take time to get into place. And some of these teams, they would sort of be brought together for a very specific goal. They would achieve that goal, and then they would disperse. But one thing that comes to mind, when talking about the improv world, so I used to watch this program on TV called "Whose Line Is It Anyway?"
I've heard of it.
You've heard of that, yeah. So the English version, right? The original British
Yeah,
version,
right.
and just sort of, I always used to marvel, right, at the people. I know what you call them, the improv artists, right?
Mhm.
I mean, they all sort of work together, right, on that show, sort of week after week after week, but just the incredible degree of cohesion um, on something that was incredibly spontaneous at the same time, but they were able just to, there was magic, right? They were just able to build and build and build on top of each other and create these incredible scenes and stories out of nothing, right?
I'm glad you said it. It's like, but what a lot of people, when they think of the improv world, we just make stuff up, which is complete opposite. We don't. And I was trying to describe. I said an improv troupe, they practice. They go, why do they practice? Because they want to make sure that they understand. They want to build that team cohesion. And when we're in some of these exercises, there are some boundaries around. So when we're doing it live and somebody throws me that curveball that I'm not expecting, I've probably either dealt with it or had curveballs thrown at me at practice, so I can handle it, process it, and then respond to it without freaking out about it.
Right.
And it goes to just being prepared.
Yeah. That brings me to, there's a saying that I love using with my clients, which actually comes from the US Navy SEALs. And they talk about, you never rise to the occasion, you always sink to the level of your training. But that's why we train hard,
Hmm.
right? When the stress hits, and this is takes me into, I'm using that in the context of um, working with leadership teams and talking about stress, right? And so this, things happen, right? The things are coming at leaders all the time, every single day, issues coming up in the business, and things can trigger people, right? And when you get triggered, when you sort of go into the fight or flight or freeze mode, your brain shuts down, the cognitive thinking shuts down. I just find this sort of fascinating, all these different layers of it. There was some research that was done on college athletes, and found that, when they're really full of adrenaline right out on the field, actually that their cognitive processing ability goes down. So you put all of these things together and realize that when I'm triggered,
Hmm.
I don't make good decisions. I can't even think my way through a problem, and I don't say, and I don't say the right things. So you train, you widen your window of tolerance, and which is exactly what you're talking about, with improv teams. And it's what I've seen, working with the teams that I work with. Train, 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 so that, when stuff comes up, it stays within your window of tolerance and it doesn't trigger you. And when you can maintain that window of tolerance, then you stay online. Central processing facility stays online, and you can respond. You can think through something and come at it from a rational point of view, and to be able to respond. And there's only, as far as I know, there's only one way you can get to that point, and that's training, right? Keep on widening your window and dealing with these things.
I do believe it was the assault on Osama bin Laden when they captured him. I think it was the Navy SEALs, and they train, just like and widen it. And when the assault began, one of the helicopters crashed. Well, they didn't plan for that. I mean, that wasn't part of their training, but because of their training, they were able to adapt a new strategy in order to achieve the ultimate goal. If without that training, that width there, eh, who knows what would have happened?
Right. Yeah.
But they were prepared for anything that came about because no plan, few plans are fully executed without any hiccups or errors or something. And how do you adapt to okay, this is reality now. What do we still need to do within the organization to achieve this goal?
Right. So it's sort of about, having all of those processes together within the team to be able to respond when things are coming up. And, you know, in sailing, this happens all the time. You're out there, the mast falls down, something breaks, there's the recent America's Cup, which was just held down in Auckland, New Zealand in March of this year. The American Challenger, in one of the races, they came around the top mark, they jibed, and a rope got caught, and they got hit by a gust of wind at the same time. And the whole boat, was sort of pushed up out of the water and flipped and capsized. And they got a hole in it, right? And so within, nanoseconds, they'd gone from like sailing this boat at 40, 45 knots to now they're over on their side in the water, and there's a hole in the boat and it's starting to sink. Talk about a crisis, right? But, to have the team be able to come around and figure out, well, what, we've just got to deal with this. We've got to deal with what's in front of us right now. Make sure everybody's safe, everybody okay, good. Now let's start dealing with the boat. Let's get something on there to stop the boat sinking. And then everybody sort of rallied around. And this is, it was an unusual story for the America's Cup, but in my experience in sailing and in so many other things, this is what life's like. Clients say, well, everything's, been going great. And then, oh my gosh, like, our major account, they've just been acquired by somebody else. And now we've lost 50% of our business. Now, what are we going to do? And if you're in a position where you're, ending up getting triggered by that, then you don't, you can't operate out of the best place to be able to now make a rational plan to go forward.
Yeah, I like to say that the collective knowledge outside your office far exceeds the collective knowledge inside your office. And
Yes.
in a situation like that, you better get your people around you, get your team around you, and try to figure something out versus you trying to figure out yourself.
Yeah. One, I think there's a lot of things. I mean, you talk about mindset, right, and changing mindset, and I'm really big on this with the teams that I work with as well, and I do it for myself. Like I'm constantly reading, philosophy. Like talking. I'm reading the book at the moment called "The Lives of the Stoics" by Ryan Holiday, and it's just fascinating. It's all about sort of ancient Greek and Roman history, um, and people who have operated in this sort of sphere of philosophy and politics, and having to deal with Seneca was one of the great Stoics, but he was trying to help Nero, the emperor of Rome, who was completely unstable and capricious and ended up just doing a bunch of really evil things. And so, they just never knew from one moment to the next. So, am I in today or am I condemned today? Am I coming to the imperial court or have I been exiled? And but they just, the part of the philosophy is about the mindset of just being able to, well, I'm here to do the best good I can with each day. Um, fate's going to deal whatever fate deals to me today. And I've just got to make the best of it. And I've got to do that, while maintaining my head and being calm and acting for the greater good, and to be able to move things forward. And I just think it's very helpful to work with teams around these sorts of mindsets. Like there's actually, there are frameworks, there's processes, there are systems that you can use to be able to deal with issues out there. And the more that you put those in place and the more you train with them, better off you're going to be being able to deal with the crisis when it comes up.
Yeah, you talk about crisis and teams and stuff, and the one thing the world of improv has taught me is to focus on the things that I have control over, not the things I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing how many of us, I'm guilty of this too, used to get focused on the wrong thing. I'm focused on why has management made this decision? Well, that decision's been made. I have no, they didn't ask me for my input. So either I accept it or I go find another job. Easy as that.
Yes.
But there's so many people who get so focused on things they absolutely have no control over that creates the stress and the stress within the team versus let's just focus on what we have control on and shut everything else out that we don't have control. We'll figure this out 10 times quicker versus focusing on the wrong things.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the number of things that you have control over that that can become a fairly small sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I mean, it's sort of like when you really sort of drill it down, the things that you really only have control over are, what's going on in your head and your reaction to events. And one of the things that I've been working on, certainly in the last year, with COVID and the pandemic and
Mm-hmm.
the effect that it's had on business and things, is just, well, what the things that I have control over is sort of like this ever shrinking
Mm-hmm.
world. And ultimately it sort of comes down to some of these practices that I engage in, which is the one thing that I actually can really have control over is my breath.
Yeah.
And, when things start, if I get triggered by something, um, what I know and what I train is that I can come back to my breath here, and I can just take a breath in. I can feel it coming into my nostrils, and I can take a breath out. Okay, and now I can do it again. And it's, to tell another US Navy SEALs story. I mean, I read about going to their training for Hell Week, which is a part of like the first week of training that they've got to get through. They don't sleep for an entire week. They're in the freezing cold of the Pacific Ocean. They're carrying boats. They're doing push-ups and sit-ups and endlessly for a week. And from what I've read, what they've learned is that the people who survive and get through to the end of that training, they bring their event horizon closer and closer and closer to themselves for the things that they control. And ultimately, so instead of sort of like worrying that, oh my gosh, it's, like I'm 6 hours into this 1 week thing, I'm already tired and freezing cold. How am I going to make it for the next week? If you have that mindset, apparently you don't tend to make it. But the people who are able to bring it in and get to this point of, all I got to do is one more push up. And if that's too, overwhelming for me to actually think about, all I got to do is take another breath. Okay, I did that. Good. Now I'm going to take another breath. And so they really bring it. That's the thing that you can control. And you keep on bringing it closer and closer to you. I think it's a fascinating concept. And I love reading about it and thinking about how I can apply those sort of principles into my own life and then bring it to my clients.
Absolutely. I when I coach people on when they're doing presentations and they begin to panic, I go, you become a shallow breather and you're not getting enough oxygen into your brain. Take a moment or two, take a couple of deep breaths, kind of relax your body. It will come back to you. But that same, it's really all comes down to just how well do we breathe under stress?
Under stress, yes.
Under stress.
Yeah.
Well, see, I literally could talk another hour with you because about 4 things popped into my mind, but I want to respect your time, and we will continue this conversation in the coming months because I'm fascinated by it. And I was thinking about trying to shake it up and do something a little bit different towards the end of the podcast with my guest and say, so what book are you reading? I already know what it is.
There you go.
You've already shared it. I can't thank you enough for taking time. It's been a pleasure meeting you, having 2 conversations. We will stay in contact. And thank you for sharing your thoughts. I mean, it's spot on. And for those of you who this podcast episode has resonated with, how can they find you, Steve?
Well, thanks, Peter. I mean, yes, it's been an incredible discussion. So I'm available on the web at catylator.com, which is my business. That's Catylator. It came from Catalyst and Incubator, which is, creating a reaction and helping that go in a business. People can email me at steve@catylator.com. And I just, get up out of bed every morning, just motivated and loving, helping people get to a better place with their lives and their business. Business should be fun, right? And I believe that creating great businesses is about, they're the foundation of great communities, and who doesn't want to live in a great community, right? So there's tools and techniques. I'm a systems guy, but I can get businesses to a better place with applying them. And I just love doing it and love the clients' reactions, feeling clarity, feeling relief, feeling wonderful that they've got a plan in place, feeling exhilarated because they know where they're going now. Awesome stuff.
God, I wish you put a little passion in that, Steve. That's awesome. I mean, for those of you, because you can't see his face right now, as he was describing this last one, his eyes just kind of got bigger, and there's a big sparkle in them, and he started smiling even more. It's like the man believes in what he does, and that is outstanding. So thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah, let's do it. Round 2. Thanks, Peter.